All right, so in this video, I'm going to cover all of the different shift factors, well, I should say most of the different shift factors that can occur to the aggregate demand curve, short-run aggregate supply curve, and long-run aggregate supply curve. This is a very commonly tested topic on the AP exam. You will get multiple questions regarding these shift factors. So let's start with AD. Okay, I cannot go over an exhaustive list of all of the different things that can increase or decrease aggregate demand. There are many of them. What you basically want to know is that if there's anything that could conceivably change consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports, right, increase or decrease either one of those, besides a change in the price level, because as you just saw in the last video, when there's a change in the price level, right, that's going to be a movement along the aggregate demand curve, like movement from point A to B. But anything else besides a change in the price level is a potential shift factor of aggregate demand if it would affect any of these four components. Okay, so here's one example. If you had a statement that said the MPC of an economy decreases from 0.75 to 0.5, that means that people are spending less money. And since spending is essentially consumption, that would mean consumption is decreasing. And therefore, if consumption decreases, aggregate demand would decrease and shift to the left. Okay, what you want to be concerned with when you are shifting these curves is what's going to be the resulting effect on price level and real GDP. So in this case, we can see that due to this situation right here, our price level in the economy, aka inflation, decreases, and we also now have a lower real GDP in our economy. Okay, so this is the kind of resulting conclusion. I'm going to switch over here to a website that will show you all of the different things that can happen. And as you can see, there's going to be many of them. So here are some other examples of items that could increase or decrease consumption. Okay, I'll highlight the ones that you probably want to be aware of. Increase in household income probably means consumers are going to spend more. Aggregate demand would shift to the right, as you can see here, leading to higher price levels and higher levels of real GDP. By the way, in this example, this economy, as you can see, is currently in a long-run equilibrium. That's just, it doesn't, sometimes we'll be there, sometimes we won't. The most important thing is that you know that this would cause an increase in aggregate demand and the resulting effects. Interest rates is commonly tested. All right, if there's a decrease in interest rates, we should hopefully know by now that that's going to encourage what they call interest-sensitive spending, such as borrowing or consuming for buying a new house, buying a new car. Okay, that's called interest-sensitive expenditures. So a decrease in interest rates would increase consumption. It would also increase investment, as we'll see below. That would be a shift factor of aggregate demand. Marginal propensity to consume or save. And then this one you might see on a test is consumer confidence. Basically, if consumers' confidence goes up, that means people feel really optimistic about the economy, and therefore they're probably going to spend more. So an increase in consumer confidence would increase aggregate demand. Don't worry about F. All of these would increase aggregate demand. Okay, I'm just going to click on this, and that you can see all of these right here would decrease and shift aggregate demand to the left. If you want to pause the video to write those down, you can. Again, don't worry about F. B is the one that you really want to worry about, and you might see A, maybe C, D, and E on a test. Okay, investment. Again, I'm going to try and go through this relatively quickly. What could increase investment? This is business spending, right? Okay, interest rates, again, is going to be the big one. A decrease in interest rate, just like consumption, decrease in interest rates are going to encourage businesses to spend and invest. Okay, I would say D would probably be the next most common one, taxes. So if you see a prompt that says business taxes decrease or that corporate taxes decrease, this essentially means that businesses now have more money than they did before. And what can they do with that money? Well, they can invest it. So we would expect aggregate demand to increase. I wouldn't worry too much about A or C. And then here's the opposite. What would cause aggregate demand to decrease? Okay. And we'll move on to government spending. Pretty simple stuff. Any type of increase in government spending could increase aggregate demand to the right. Infrastructure is items, like buildings and bridges, railways, stuff like that. That's our infrastructure. Wartime, and just other types of government purchases. And as you can see, a decrease in aggregate demand would shift left. Again, get used to this, what your graph looks like when aggregate demand increases or decreases, and make sure that you have the correct labeling as well. Okay, on to the last one. And again, this is still all shift factors of aggregate demand. Like I said, there's a lot of them. Okay, what could cause an increase in net exports? Right? Yeah, I will point out the most important ones here. Exchange rates, you don't have to worry about too much. We're going to talk about that in Unit 6. First, if foreigners just want to buy more of our products, if there's an increase in the desirability of products by foreign consumers, that could potentially increase aggregate demand, shift it to the right. Okay, if our goods look cheaper because of decreases in the price level. Now, again, in the previous video, I said that a change in the price level, right, should really be a movement. If the price level goes down, it should be a movement along the aggregate supply and demand curve. I think that's more accurate, but this is also saying here that a decrease in price level, right, makes our goods look cheaper, which would increase net exports, which could possibly cause a shift in the aggregate demand. But I think this is more so the international effect right here, okay? But we do want to kind of be aware of that as well. Oh, this is a big one. Increase in household incomes of foreign countries, right? So if people in Europe, people in Japan, if they're making more money now, we assume that they're going to buy more of everything. So they'll buy more stuff where they live at home, but they also might purchase more from us. And so therefore exports would go up. Okay, and don't worry about E. And here's the opposite. So that is an example of all the different things that could cause aggregate demand to increase or decrease. All right, moving along. Let's go talk about short-run aggregate supply. Okay, there's 4 big ones from what I can essentially gather. They're very similar to what we talked about in the beginning of the year, which is basic supply and demand. So if you recall, whenever there's a change in the cost of inputs to production, this is going to be your most commonly tested shift factor, specifically wages. Wages is talked about a lot in macroeconomics and aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Okay, if there's an increase or decrease in wages or the cost of resources, that will shift SRAS to the left or to the right. Changes in productivity will also do the same. And here's something interesting. So we just saw this in aggregate demand. Changes in business taxes is not only an aggregate demand shift factor, but it's also a SRAS, a short-run aggregate supply shift factor. Okay, this is the only one to my knowledge. Okay, the only prompt where this can actually shift both curves at the same time. All other instances, we assume that only one curve is going to shift in one direction. But for a number of reasons, you can argue that business taxes could either increase aggregate demand or decrease it depending on what's happening with taxes, or it could also lead to increases in short-run aggregate supply. All right, so keep that in mind that this is for both AD and SRAS. And then this one shows up every now and then. This one's a little bit, I don't know if I'd say trickier, but you have to put a little bit more thought into it. Changes in expectations of future prices. So here's an example of that. if you're a business and for whatever reason, all businesses, let's say they believe that their inputs to production are going to increase in the future. So oil is a great example of a cost of input to production. Almost every business has to use oil in some way, shape, or form, whether it's transporting their good or whether it's in their actual production process. But if everyone believes that the price of oil is going to skyrocket in 3 months, well, businesses think about that and they say, well, I don't want to pay those higher costs later on. I'd rather increase my supply now while I can. So if we expect future prices for inputs to production to increase, businesses are going to supply more to the market today. So that means that the SRAS curve would increase and shift to the right. Okay, so that is expectations in future prices. I have an example down here of what that would look like if it shifted to the right, just to give you a visual. I was looking at some of the practice FRQs that we did last week. An increase in short run aggregate supply is shifting to the right. Okay, some of you moved it in the other direction and shifted left. Remember, increase in supply or demand always to the right. Decrease in supply or demand, always shift your curve to the left. Okay, and here's our resulting effects on price level and real GDP. Okay, last one is the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, I didn't have that drawn here, but we know that's the vertical LRAS. And by the way, the vertical LRAS, I didn't include it here just because we don't know where this economy's at, right? If we were told that this economy was in a recession, then your LRAS would be somewhere over here, right? Or if we're in a long run equilibrium, your LRAS would be right down the middle. Okay, so we're going to draw the LRAS based on where the question tells us to. And so keep in mind that the LRAS curve essentially represents potential output for an economy. And so therefore think of that as being synonymous with what we talked about with our PPC curve, with that PPC line also representing potential output. So there's really only two factors that could either increase or decrease the long run aggregate supply curve and or potential output. And we've already talked about these before. An increase in the availability of resources or increases in technology would shift the LRAS curve to the right. Okay. And so obviously we would just, if our LRAS was here, we would just shift to the right and draw another one here, right? Keep in mind, like I said, we're going to talk about this a lot. Low interest rates are a catalyst to potential increases in long run economic growth. All right. So here's the frame of thought again. If we have lower interest rates, which we just talked about with aggregate demand, right? If interest rates go down, that would cause consumption to increase and investment to increase. This is going along the investment lines here, and decrease in interest rates will increase investment, which means that businesses are investing more in this idea of capital stock, right? They're buying more equipment, more machinery, doing more research and development. And if they do that, we can have increases in long run economic growth, which would then lead to the LRAS curve shifting to the right. So although a decrease in interest rates is not a shift factor in itself of the LRAS curve, it can lead to an increase in long run economic growth, because if we do this, basically number two has a really good chance of taking shape, right? Having increases in technology due to this increase in capital stock. Okay. So that video hopefully sums up all of the different shift factors: aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply.